We're back. Some of us are back. Some of us are somewhat back.
Boy, Danny, your summary of what's going on with Stichel was just right on. I mean, I am just absolutely blown away with season 3. I'm only 2.5 episodes. I'm in the middle of episode 3, so don't tell me anything.
Okay,
So
we
far,
just finished 3 last night. We're right there with
the 3rd season or 3rd episode of season
3rd
3?
episode.
Yeah.
Well, I've only seen 1, so be careful what you say.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Karen. I didn't realize you were on. My apologies. So yes.
No, I saw the first episode, but not before.
When the whole thing with Libby was announced, the way they did that, where the gallery owner just kind of says it, and in the previous scenes, there's all these. He's in the taxi with her. I mean, Karen has seen this, and I don't think Lou is listening.
I'm listening. I haven't seen any of them yet, but don't worry about it. Go ahead and talk. Surprises don't bother me. So go.
There's a thing in Mexican literature called magical realism, where the line between dreams and fantasies and hallucinations and what's really reality get blurred. And that's what's happening here, is that he's talking to her in the taxi on the way to this gallery opening. And then when the gallery opening comes, the guy walks up there and announces she's not with us anymore. And it's like, oh my God, I was just like, that was the most, in terms of just the quality of the writing. I'll shut up now. I think there's other people on the.
No, it's beautifully done. And it's taking on some really huge issues.
And the Hasidim are the people in this movie, I'll put it that way, are reacting to it like people.
Yes. It's the focus in Stiesel is not on how different they are, but how much like the rest of us they are.
That was clear in the first 2 seasons, but this is just like in spades.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to seeing the rest of the seasons and whatever beyond happens. It's definitely riveting. Yeah. So for those of you who were part of the first hour, was kind of an interesting overlap with what we were talking about in our class 3 weeks ago, which had to do with the role of Dveikut and how important that was in spiritual life. I would say, however, that the Baal Shem Tov may not have intended this kind of intense dveikut to be a priority for everyone. It may be that it was more something for him and for his students and for a certain elite of people who really excelled at that. And then those people, the Rebbes, the tzaddikim, they're kind of like the bridge between the rest of the people and God. And not everybody is going to have that level of dveikut that the tzaddik exemplifies. We've, there's this emphasis in especially early Hasidism that puts things that are mundane, things that are physical, into spiritual terms. There's a value which is called avodah begashmiyut, service through the physical. Okay? You worship God through physical acts, through eating and drinking, assuming that that's accompanied with, the right attitude. After all, God is present in all things, including the physical. And so, by relating to those physical things, we lift them up and dedicate them to a higher purpose, and that, brings us along. And so you infuse material reality with a certain level of holiness. So, for instance, among the misnagdim, among those who were opposed to Hasidism, spiritual life also involved a certain degree of self-denial, taking on additional fasts beyond those that were required in the law. And the Hasidic leaders are generally opposed to that. It's like, let's not take on more self-denial. Let's accept certain physical things, but take the holiness that exists within them and try to draw that up and devote it to a higher purpose. For instance, you don't abstain from permitted marital sex, right? You bring to it an awareness of the holiness that is part of that, and you acknowledge to God how special and how beautiful and how holy that is, even as one accepts the pleasure of it. So, worship isn't all about spiritual things. We take the physical things and make them spiritual, make them more spiritual, dedicate them to a higher purpose. And so we're going to see in the next text how the tzaddik will take those, certain physical things and make them serve spiritual purposes. And so, for instance, here in this text number 8, Dov Ber of Mezerich talks about how the acts of the righteous are greater than the making of heaven and earth. It's a Talmudic teaching, right? But what does it mean? It means the act of creation involved the emergence of something out of nothing. The tzaddikim involved turning something into nothing. In whatever they do, even if it is something physical, like eating, they raise up the holy sparks within that food. And so in everything they do, they convert something into the divine nothingness. Right? So this Talmudic text at the outset of the teaching, that refers to Torah sages, and that their deeds take the creation to its ultimate purpose. But here, what does the tzaddik do? The tzaddik turns the self, the nullification of the self, to the infinite God. Turns it into that part of God that cannot be understood, and in so doing turns something into nothing. Now, this idea is not new to Hasidism. You have it in the early medieval period. You find it in the first Ashkenazi comprehensive code of Jewish law, the Arba Turim, the four pillars, which is 13th, 14th century material. And so, this idea of, turning one's self towards nothingness through the physical, it's not a new idea in Hasidism, but you see this trend, this direction in many, many early Hasidic teachings. Comments or questions here? Yes, Lou.
Is this where the joke comes from? Who thinks he's nothing?
Not so much. But it is where the impulse comes from that the tzaddik himself is willing to say that he is nothing, meaning he turns himself to nothingness. He takes his physical self and devotes it to the divine nothingness. I hope that isn't too confusing. Or is it just confusing enough?
Well, this whole thing is a bit confusing. Instead of converting something into nothing, instead of something into something more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's the approach that the early Hasidic teachers take. Okay, let's go to number 9 here. Okay. And this is a text about just how intense Dveikut can be. Right? This is from a book that compiled many different Hasidic teachings, one of the early books. The author, Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, is a disciple of Dov Ber Mezrich. And here is what he says. Dveikut means that there should be nothing separating one from God. And then you can have Dveikut. What does the Baal Shem Tov say about this? It says it's impossible to glue 2 pieces of silver except by scraping clean the 2 places where the glue is to adhere. And so too, between God and the person, there can be no rust or anything separating. Rust, could refer here to sin, or it could refer to other priorities, lesser priorities. Like, Torah study is not sinful, right? But maybe it's a distraction from Dveikut. And so he says, this is the meaning of this verse from Proverbs. If you call out to understanding, if you seek her out like silver. Okay? So let there be nothing between yourself and God. That's the goal, and that's what it means to have Dveikut, to cleave unto God. Now, even if you're not Hasidic, right, cleaving to God is one of the mitzvot in the Torah. Okay? You'll see it when you come to Parshat Akev, the 3rd Parsha in Deuteronomy. Okay? So if that's a mitzvah, then even non-Hasidic Jews have to at least give it some credence and give it, some priority. Last piece here similarly, tradition from the Seer of Lublin about the Baal Shem Tov. He said, whenever a new chassid came to him, he instantly took his soul out of him, cleansed it of all stain and rust, and put it back into him, restored to the state it had been in the hour he was born. Right? So this is part of the task of the tzaddik, right? What does the tzaddik do? The tzaddik takes each person who comes to him and tries to restore him to a place where he can fully cleave to God. That's the job of the Hasidic master. Right? Now, this is one area where I think, we haven't translated the role of the Hasidic Rebbe into the congregational rabbi. I mean, we don't normally see congregational rabbis function as including, separating people from sin, right? That's your job, right? Nobody ever said to me, Rabbi, one of the things we want you to do as the rabbi of the congregation is to do your best to, get people to stop sinning and help them cleave to God more fully. That just didn't happen. That was not part of my job description anywhere I worked as a rabbi. But I don't know, maybe it should be. Comments, suggestions, questions? Yes, Karen.
I guess I'm just thinking more about the term cleave to God in terms of where we are today in the conservative synagogue. I'm not quite sure I know exactly what that means. I guess it means putting God should always be on your mind in all decisions and actions you take and that kind of thing. I mean, are we supposed to think about God all of our waking moments? And
that God should always be in the forefront of our thought. What does God want us to do? Let me again share with you this piece that I borrowed from Yitzhak Buxbaum about what it means to have devekut. He said, it's like driving a car. There are all sorts of things you can be doing while you're driving a car, right? You may be carrying on a conversation with a passenger or even with someone on your, handless cell phone. You may be sipping your coffee. You may be listening to the radio, right? You could be doing all sorts of things, but what's the number one thing you're doing? You're focusing on the road ahead because that's life and death. Now, for the Hasidim, devekut is a matter of life and death. And maybe, if not life and death, it should be a higher priority for the rest of us. That's what this, I think, is meant to suggest. And it's what it says to us. Yes, Rose?
How did the Chassid cleanse the soul of those that came to him?
I speak up just a little bit, Rose.
How did the Chassid cleanse the soul of those that came to him?
Well, the tzaddik, by virtue of having a stronger devekut with God, is blessed with the ability, in some mystical sense, to read the soul of his followers. that he has some soul connection to those who follow him. And perhaps in part they follow him because they have that kind of connection to his soul as opposed to some other Hasidic master. Right? And by virtue of this gift and the power of his connection with God, being able to read his disciples' souls means that he's able to lead them to a higher path, if not to, ultimately rub out sin from their personality.
So this is
Now,
all mythical.
so there is a sense in which this is very mythical, but Hasidism doesn't treat it as mythical. Hasidism treats it as very real, right? So, if you are a Hasid, or even if you're not a Hasid, but you go to have a personal meeting, to have what's called Yechidus with the Rabbi, right? And you ask for spiritual guidance from the Rabbi. There's a sense in which this is a very powerful moment where the Rebbe is able to take you from where you are and guide you farther down the path and fix you in the right direction. Now, I'm not here to argue that that always works. There is some evidence that within the Hasidic world, it's a very powerful experience.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments here? Okay. So now we're going to move on into the next segment of an examination of Hasidic teachings. One of the very important teachings is a term hitlahavut. Hitlahavut comes from the word lahav, which means a flame, right? Hitlahavut is like being a flame, being in a spiritual state of rapture, right? So that when one prays, one is really carried along, is basically in flames, right? So prayer is meant to be like this. Prayer is meant to be this state of hitlahavut, a very enthusiastic, passionate experience of God's presence, right? Now, does this happen all the time? Probably not, but it's certainly a goal for Hasidic prayer, right? And, once you've had that, and I'm saying this not just from the Hasidic standpoint, but if you've ever had a moment of rapture in prayer, it's like a new baseline for you. It's like every other prayer experience gets judged in or evaluated better in comparison to that. And you say, well, I'm not going to have that too often, but boy, that is the best kind of prayer. That is the most locked in kind of prayer experience that I could ever have. Right? So it's a new baseline. So while keeping the Torah and the mitzvot is still a high priority, the ultimate goal is having this kind of state of exaltation. Okay? And an illustration of this comes with the first text in this segment. Right? This story of Zusia, right? Now, most of you, if you've heard the name Zusia, there's this very famous story about his, when he's deathbed, where he says, God will not ask me why I wasn't like Moses or why I wasn't like God will ask me, why were you not more like Zusia, right? Why were you not the person you were supposed to be, right? Which is a wonderful lesson about, how in our lifetime we ought to be the people that we are meant to be. We should live up to our potential. Nobody tells this story that we're looking at here about Zusia, right? That in all the years that he spent in the base midrash of Dov Ber, he never heard a single teaching from Dov Ber. Dov Ber would open the book and he would read, the introductory passage of a Torah section that begins with the words, Vayomer Hashem, and God has spoken. And immediately Zusia was seized by such ecstasy when he heard those words that he was unable to listen further. And whenever he heard these words, he was carried away and he would shout at the top of his voice, "The Lord has spoken, the Lord has spoken." And he couldn't stop. And so they'd have to take him out into the courtyard so that they could listen to Dov Ber teach in peace and quiet. And he didn't resist being taken out because he had no idea what was going on. His body is shaking, he's shouting, he's throwing himself around, and it takes him a long, long time to quiet down. And by the time he got back, it's over. Dov Ber has finished teaching. So he never heard a single teaching by Dov Ber. And this kind of ecstasy is called hit lahavut. Okay? Comments or questions here?
That's pretty funny.
Yes. Yes. And it doesn't happen too much at Beth Yeshurun.
If it happened today at Beth Yeshurun, they take him out to the courtyard too.
Well, sure, and we have a courtyard, so it's perfectly possible, right? We just call for security, a little help, and imagine this, if Rabbi Strauss were up in the pulpit and he starts quoting scripture, and people say, "Wah! God has spoken." I don't know how Rabbi Strauss would respond to that, but I think security might be brought in. Yeah, but that's hit lahavut, and it's a very high priority in Hasidic teaching. Let's look at number 2. Right? Another teaching from this classic collection of Hasidic teachings, Keter Shem Tov. Before beginning to pray, one should reflect that he is prepared to die while praying as a result of his concentration, and there are actually some whose concentration in prayer is so intense that if nature were left to itself, they would die after just 5 or 6 words in the presence of the blessed God. And once he thinks of this, he will say to himself, "Why should I have any hidden motive or pride while praying?" Because he's ready to die after just a few words. And in reality, it is the blessed God's great mercy that God gives him strength to complete his prayer and remain alive. So what is this addresses an issue, which is that, when I'm in prayer, how do I avoid distractions? How do I avoid thinking about myself? How do I avoid, let's say, what the Hasidim referred to euphemistically as strange thoughts, right? How do I just think of God? So real prayer, it says, is a way of nullifying yourself. And that is potentially permanent. Right? Serious prayer is a serious business. It's giving yourself up. And if you really have hit lahavut, if your prayer is rapturous and has a flame within it, you could burn up. Okay? That's so that's a real threat. And this brings us to the teachings of one of the great Hasidic rabbis, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Right? Was a disciple of Dov Ber, although he probably knew the Baal Shem Tov near the end of his life. And the thing we know about Levi Yitzchak is that he had this passionate love for other Jewish people. And he had a high degree of hit lahavut, but within that, he always challenged God. And he's, constantly pleading with God for the welfare of other Jews. The story has it that when he was a young married man, his father-in-law, who basically supported him in the early years of his marriage, as was customary in much of Jewish culture, his father-in-law was very much opposed to Hasidism, and he saw Levi Yitzchak being drawn in more and more and more, and he was very opposed to that. And finally, he said to Levi Yitzchak, "I forgive you everything if you'll just tell me what you've learned with the Maggid of Mezrich that is so special." And Levi Yitzchak responded by saying, "What I learned there is that there is a God in heaven who created the world." His father said, "Well, that's not so profound. Everybody knows that." And he called in the maid, right, this non-Jewish woman who serves the family. And he asks her, "Do you know who created the world?" And she says, "Oh, well, God in heaven," right? Well, Levi Yitzchak said, "Yes, anyone can say that, but only one who has learned it from the mouth of the Maggid can know it." That's the difference. Right? That was the power of Hasidic teaching for Levi Yitzchak. Levi Yitzchak had a rough time starting out as a rabbi. He was run out of several rabbinic positions. And it was only when he settled in the northern Ukraine in the city of Berdichev that things went well, and he turned his community into a major Hasidic center. And he really led the way in kind of shaping the role of the tzaddik for many communities. And through his own writing, one of the first individual collections of Hasidic teachings, certainly one of the few that was written by the Rebbe himself, Levi Yitzchak produced this book called Kedushat Levi, one of the most popular sources of Jewish teaching, from which we have this little teaching here on hit lahavut from text number 3, which essentially says that the goal is constant hit lahavut. And he says you should always pray that way, with a lot of hit lahavut. You should pray in rapture. But right now, we don't live in a time where we have such higher consciousness. And we can't start out that way. We only get there along the way. Maybe if we're, halfway through the service, we get to a point where we have that rapture, right? But when the Mashiach comes, then everyone will know the Lord, and everybody will be able to get hit lahavut right from the get-go, right from the beginning. You open up and bam, you go into that altered state, you go into that state of rapture, and that you hold on to, and it holds on to you better. It holds on to you for the rest of your prayer. So that's the goal of it, right? And that's the difference in prayer. That is a pretty constant emphasis in early Hasidism. And so again, prayer becomes such an important part of Jewish life, not just the mitzvah of prayer itself, but a particular intensity in prayer. And that carries over into other mitzvot too. It's not just about doing the mitzvah, it's about doing it with feeling. It's about the place where doing that mitzvah takes you. Right? And in this kind of prayer, you sort of lose yourself. You lose yourself. You're like Zusia, right? You just go into that ecstatic state, and it's like your own person becomes nothing, and you are carried away in that state of ecstasy. And that also keeps you from falling into distracting thoughts, stray thoughts, right? And that's the subject of really the next two texts we're going to look at. But before I go further, let me stop and ask if anybody has comments, questions, what have you.
I'll just make a comment.
Please.
I was thinking about meditation, and which I organized the group on Wednesday night, and I led a couple weeks ago, and I was talking about knowing that you're alive versus feeling that you're alive, and it's somewhat the same, I think, as what this is discussing. It's there's some days, I mean, we all know intellectually we're alive, we all know there's God, but some days you're kind of like you're running on all cylinders, and this, you're just feeling it a lot more, and it's easy to live in the moment, and I'm speaking for myself. I can go out and notice every tree and the birds speaking, and all these things that other days I might just go out and kind of not pay much attention to. And so in days like that where I'm really in the moment, life does feel very different, and I am feeling much more connected to God. So I can, I don't know if I wouldn't call it rapture. I don't know what that means exactly, but I think we probably all have those times where we are at a place where we're feeling a lot more connected to God.
Mm-hmm. What you're describing, Karen, sounds like what many of us refer to as being in the zone.
Right.
Right? I would suggest that that's a certain level of hit lahavut, maybe not the kind of level that Levi Yitzchak refers to, or that Zusha experiences. You're not totally carried away with that. The Lord is
screaming out loud.
But it's a certain level of that.
Right. A feeling of excitement and almost kind of a thrill of and a marvel at all the things. And the fact that I'm alive, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. So I think, that gives us a way to relate to this, at least to some degree. We may not have experienced heat lahavut, but most of us have had the experience of, being in that zone where we're experiencing our being alive and having a difference.
Right. And you almost don't need, I mean, the way he talked about, he didn't need to hear anything else, or didn't hear anything else after he heard that God spoke.
Yeah.
You don't need to really have a conversation during those times. I mean, that's fine too, but just the awareness and the being in the moment is such a powerful feeling, that because you recognize it, at least for me, it being so different from those times
Yes.
that I'm not there.
Yes. And by the way, I would urge you, in your work, not to get too carried away. I don't know if Zusha's form of ecstasy would really be that helpful in your day-to-day work.
Probably not.
Yeah, it's the way it goes. I don't feel like that either, but
Well, maybe I'm just a bit more restrained.
well, yeah, and Zusha is nothing if not a little strange. But
No, I said I'm more restrained. Like maybe I just
restrained, yeah, okay.
right, was raised to not make a big scene, or that kind of
Yes,
thing.
yes. That's probably a good thing, Karen. Okay, so let's look at number 4, which is what the Shulchan Aruch, the 16th century code of Jewish law by Joseph Caro, tells us about emphasis in prayer. And he says, one who prays must direct his heart to the meaning of the words he brings forth from his lips, as if the Shekhinah were before him. In other words, if you're going to pray, it's got to be with kavanah, with intention, with direction. Okay? He must remove all troubling thoughts, leaving only his pure intention in prayer. He should consider it as if he were speaking before a king of flesh and blood, for whom he would order his words carefully and with much intentionality, so that he would not stumble. All the more should he do so before the King of all kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, who plumbs all thoughts. And this is what the pious and men of accomplishment would do, sitting in solitude and directing their prayers until they would be stripped of corporeality and strengthen their intellect until they come near the level of prophecy. And if some other thought intruded during prayer, they would be silent until this thought would be nullified, thinking of matters which would subdue the heart and redirect it toward the Heavenly Father, and not of matters which divert them. Okay, so that's already a very high level of expectation for prayer. The prayer is supposed to have this kind of kavanah, of direction, and that actually approaches near the level of prophecy. Okay? That's what prayer is supposed to be. That's the classical view. Now, it is true that Joseph Caro is definitely one of the mystics, but in his Shulchan Aruch, it's much more about what does the law require, and not always, what does Kabbalah require? What does the mystical view require? Okay? He's writing a Shulchan Aruch that is intended for all Jews. But he says your prayer has to be at a high level. Now, compare that to the teaching in Tzavat HaRivash, the testament to the Baal Shem Tov. This begins by quoting the teaching in Pirkei Avot, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself, what am I? And he says, when in prayer, you must be stripped of corporeality and not feel your self-existence in this world. And that is what Hillel meant. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I get to the point where I no longer know or feel myself, and I get into that zone, I feel that hitlahavut, I don't even know if I'm in this world or not, then stray thoughts are not a problem because they don't intrude on that. But if I am for myself, if I consider myself as having separate existence in this world, then I am nothing. What am I? What is my service worth? Because then the stray thoughts, they do disturb me, and I am as nothing in this world. The real purpose of my existence is divine service, but I cannot do this because I'm disturbed by these stray thoughts. Yes, Daniel.
I hope this is on target, on subject. For me, the act of creativity, and for me that means writing and photography, is the only time that I really get out of myself. One of my mentors and famous photographer in the 50s and 60s said that when he's shooting, taking pictures, he is getting out of himself. I think it's a common thing to experience for people that are deeply involved, get deeply into their thinking. That's when I feel what's the word, in the moment, in the present, in the zone.
Yeah.
I sincerely wish, though, that I could get that through prayer. It just doesn't happen for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
No,
Sorry.
no, that's, I think that that's a very common feeling, right? It, even people who have a way of getting into that state, well, let's just call it an altered state for a moment, right? They don't necessarily find that when they get into Jewish prayer. They may have the skills to read the words, they may have some understanding of what the words mean, and they may subscribe to the goal of prayer, whatever that goal is. But it doesn't take them there to that level. All right? Now, I mean, a lot of people in Jewish life would argue that that's perfectly okay, that you get something out of prayer, even if it doesn't take you to that level, right? Because some of it is reflexive, after all. You focus on certain thoughts, and those thoughts work their way into you over time, right? That's a much more intellectual view of prayer, and this is a much more experiential view of prayer. Understand? Okay, so this is a very high level of prayer. And I mean, the Shulchan Aruch, that's a pretty high level of expectation for prayer just by itself. And the Hasidic expectation is well beyond that, right? That this standard of self-nullification, that's the way to go. That is the way to avoid any kind of distraction. And it just takes you to that state, and there you are. Right? If you are bothered by distractions, by stray thoughts, right? It's because you are for yourself. You are too caught up in yourself. Okay? And by the way, just in case you didn't get this, stray thoughts is really code language for inappropriate sexual thoughts that come along during prayer. Karen, you had a question or comment.
Well, I was going to say that I think we all have stray thoughts. I don't believe that anybody, Hasidic or not, doesn't have stray thoughts. But I didn't know that it really meant just about sexual. I mean, I assume that was part of it, but I assumed that you weren't supposed to be thinking about what you were going to have for dinner or when you're going to the grocery store.
Although those could also be stray thoughts.
Right. And I don't think
the biggest problem, and because there's a big difference between the thought of something that is not permitted, as opposed to what you're going to buy at the grocery store, which is just something that's not appropriate for that moment.
Right. But either way, I think the goal is probably to notice that and bring yourself back quickly and try to get back on track. But
right.
We all stray. I don't think it's not humanly possible, in my opinion, to not have that's just the way our minds are. It just works that way. And I think that's been shown medically. So. Okay.
So I'll accept the notion that none of us is perfect. I think we can all agree on that. I would also suggest, and Hasidic teaching certainly suggests this, that with concerted effort, with practice, with a certain degree of constancy, one can become much better at that. Just as, the practice of meditation. So, you may work up to a place where you started out maybe meditating 5 minutes a day. And there were all sorts of distracting thoughts that bothered you, that kind of got in the way, and you had to start again, like 6 times in 5 minutes, right? But with practice, you got to a point where you could do it for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe more.
Right. And I can go longer, but even during those periods, we all lose focus for a moment. And that's the whole point of meditation, is you're supposed to just try to recognize it quickly and bring yourself back to the present. I just don't think it's possible to never have your mind stray from something, but that's just my opinion.
Right. But the point is,
you get better at it.
You get better at it.
Right. And it's the awareness too that you're straying.
Yes. Yes. So, have a little bit of experience in meditation too. And that's, that's a big priority, getting into the groove, practicing, and being aware of what you're doing and what your thoughts, are, and how to manage that.
Right. And I guess it's the same in prayer too. I mean, you can find yourself drifting off and then choose to whether you want to come back to the prayer, or if you find it meaningless, I guess you might prefer to be off somewhere else. But it's the noticing that you're straying that helps.
Yes, that never happens to me, by the way.
I'm sure it doesn't. I was going to ask you that, but I know it goes without saying.
Okay. Other comments or questions we're going? All right. Let's go to number 6. And again, from Levi Yitzchak. There's a level of normal prayer and there's a level beyond. He says, there are those who serve the blessed God with their human intellect, and there are others whose gaze is fixed as if on ayin, nothingness. And this is impossible without divine help. And he who is granted this supreme degree with divine help to contemplate the ayin loses the reality of his intellect, and he is as if stricken dumb. Okay, so there's that altered state again. But when he returns from such a contemplation to the essence of his intellect, he finds it full of the divine splendor, the shefa, the flow, which comes from above. Okay? And so there's normal prayer, and there's a level way beyond that, just through the grace of God, you have that possibility. You surrender your intellect. You give up any sense of your physical self, and you have that altered state. Okay? And he certainly had the Baal Shem Tov, that is, had a certain balanced practice in prayer, but you had to have a certain minimum of kavanah. Otherwise, wasn't enough. You needed to try again. Right? So there's a certain range of positions on this in Hasidism. How much and how quickly and how frequently you need to get into that altered state. That's not what they call it, but that's what I'll call it. Okay. Other comments or questions here? Let's go to number 7. Okay. From Tzavat Harivash says, do not recite too many psalms before prayer so as not to weaken yourself and not be able to say the mandatory prayers. The Psuke de Zimra, Shema Yisrael, the Amida, you want to be able to do those with great deveikud. And if you do too much preparation before prayer, then you're going to be spent by the time you get to the stuff that is really required. So start by saying these primary prayers with deveikud. And then, so if you have additional strength, then you can do other stuff with deveikud. And also, before Ne'ilah, say the Machzor, but say it with a lesser consciousness so that you can pray Ne'ilah, that which, that's the big target. You want to be able to do that with Godlut, with greater consciousness, with great deveikud. Okay? So, it was very common in this period for Jews to warm up for prayer by reading Psalms or spending a little time in meditation before they started the service itself. Here, Hasidim are discouraged from doing that because you only got so much power, and you want to spend the power where you really need it. Even on Yom Kippur, you should accept that you're not going to maintain a high, an altered state the whole day long. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have some highs and lows. So have a little, give yourself a little bit of a break now and then, and save some energy for the Ne'ilah, for the end of the service. Okay. By the way, the fact that he refers to saying psalms and song of songs, right? The Hasidim frequently would read Song of Songs Erev Shabbat, either before the service or after the service, but frequently before. And so, you didn't want that to dissipate your energy for the rest of the prayers, Erev Shabbat. Right? Any comments or questions here? Yes, Lou.
I thought that Pazuke de Zimra was created to use that word, to help put you in a state of kavanah. And so these other Psalms that they're referring to is to prepare you for Pazukei de Zimra. How far back how does this change?
Right. For most Jews, Psuke de Zimra is the warm-up. For the Hasidim, these other things were the warm-ups. So, they said, do the other things, but don't dissipate your energy in them. Just let them get you ready. And do the rest with Hit Lahavut. Okay, we've hit the end of our time. Thank you all very much, and we'll carry on here next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Two great classes.
Shavua
Thank
Tov.
you.
See you. Bye-bye.